A couple years back, I had the privilege of speaking at a leadership conference right here in Singapore. It was a youth leadership conference, and the presentation right before mine was really notable. It was really interesting for a couple reasons. So, it was given by a gentleman by the name of Ong Keng Yong. So at the time, he was the High Commissioner from Singapore to Malaysia. It was notable for a few reasons. So first, he was a really dynamic speaker. He was running around the stage. He was jumping up and down and telling all these stories. And mid-sentence, kind of like Steve just pulled out, he pulled out his phone and he answered it. And he must have been there for what seemed like an eternity, but it was probably just a couple minutes. Later, we found out the reason for that was because the Prime Minister of Malaysia had actually just called for elections, so there was something secret going on in the background. But the last reason why it was notable, which is kind of really relevant for us here, is that it was the first time that the power and the potential of Southeast Asia was really seared into my mind. This gentleman was also the former Secretary General of ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations. And so, as we kind of explore cryptocurrency opportunities in the region, I thought it'd be interesting to just step back and take a look at the region from a macro perspective. So I'll just shamelessly copy and paste a couple of his higher level points as we start our discussion here. So, what is Southeast Asia? Why are we looking at Southeast Asia? What's the big deal? I don't want to kind of overplay this. Southeast Asia, it's a big area of the world. It's not China, it's not India, it's not the United States. But I think relative to the attention that gets paid to the region, there's a lot more opportunity than what people think. So 10 countries, you have a population of 618 million people. And if you think about that, Europe, the EU has a population of less than that, 500 million. So now Europe has a lot of things going for it. It's clearly further along in its economic development. They have fantastic wine and great food. But just to think that this part of the world has an even greater numerical gravitas than the EU is actually a little bit startling. If you drill down a little bit into the demographics as well, they have fantastically young populations here. One of the big mega trends that's shaping tomorrow is the rise of aging populations and the impact that will have. And the fact that folks are very young in this part of the world means that economies are continuing to grow, consumption power is continuing to grow, and that includes almost every country here in ASEAN except for Singapore. Singapore has one of the lowest replacement ratios in the world, it's 1.1. So they struggle, like a lot of other developed economies, to get people to have more kids. But thankfully, Singapore is only 5 million per person population out of 600 million. Incidentally, my wife is setting up an incubator for female entrepreneurs here in Singapore. So it's specifically to address this problem. So if any of you are female entrepreneurs in the Bitcoin space, feel free to come see me afterwards. So there are a couple other things working for the region. You have fantastic GDP growth, 10%, partly because of demographics, partly also just because we're working off a low base. Compare that to China, which is slightly lower at 7-8%. Smartphone penetration growth is growing massively here. And oh geez, this is an old presentation. Here we go. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of potential. There are also a lot of challenges to the region as well. So if you take a look from a religious perspective as well, you have a very strong kind of Christian community, a very strong Buddhist contingent, and the largest Muslim country in the world, in Indonesia here in the region. You have a very wide linguistic and cultural diversity, and probably the biggest problem in integrating and development is that there's such a wide gap between countries and socioeconomic status. So on the right here you see Cambodia, and on the left this is actually a picture from Audi Fashion Fest right here in Singapore. And just to illustrate this, we all know that in 1990, East and West Germany had a really tough time integrating because the GDP per capita difference was so staggering. I do quite a bit of nonprofit work in North Korea, but there was a report put out by Goldman Sachs 3 or 4 years ago stating that unification in Korea would be really difficult because the gap between North and South Korea was actually 7 times the gap that we saw in unification Germany in 1990. And just to put that in perspective, the GDP per capita of Singapore is about twice that, roughly, of South Korea, and Cambodia is about half of what it is in North Korea. So we're looking at a gap here, just within ASEAN, 4 times the difference between what you have in North and South Korea, which was 7 times the difference of what you had in East and West Germany. So integration, there's been a lot of talk about a unified kind of ASEAN economic zone, similar to what we have in the EU. I'm a little bit more skeptical than some people on that point. But it's certainly an interesting prospect. Now the deadline is 2015. It's gotten pushed back a number of times. but this is probably the biggest challenge to that kind of integration. So what are the opportunities? If we drill down a little bit more specifically, I'm a venture capitalist. I run a cross-border VC firm called Amasia. And most of our investments actually are in the US and companies that have some sort of angle in Asia, whether it be from a market penetration angle or partnerships from a manufacturing angle or an outsourcing angle, mostly with India or the Philippines. Some of our investment is here in the region, so we are looking at the space, not just in cryptocurrencies, but broadly speaking in digital technology. So we like to think about pain points as opportunities, right? So what are the pain points that people have in the region? Well, people need to store money, people need to transfer money, merchants need to process money, as Steve was talking about, and funds and high net worths want to diversify, and countries want to address income gaps. So we'll just take a look at each of these in turn. So people need to store money. Let's talk about bank accounts for a second. Most of the people in this room, we've kind of grown up with a bank account, or at least in a household that had a bank account. And so it's very easy for us to kind of take it for granted. Why do we have bank accounts in the first place? Well, from a very basic perspective, the first thing that we need bank accounts for is to store money. Eventually, it's about transferring money. When you get into more sophisticated economies, it can be used as collateral for private banking accounts and all sorts of leverage transactions and so forth. We can see here that in the region, you have some countries, like right here in Singapore, you have 98% penetration of bank accounts, and in some countries, it's much lower. 20% in Indonesia, 4% in Cambodia. And so what does that mean? Well, it leads to a system that's very susceptible to shock. And I used to be a commodities trader, so I think the easiest way to think about this from a system perspective is the difference between kind of oil markets and power markets. So oil market is an example of a system that has a lot of storage, right? When you get crude oil, you take it out of the ground, it goes into a tank somewhere. It sits there for a while, it gets shipped by pipeline, or you stick it on boats, and it goes somewhere to a refinery, where it gets, again, stuck in some tank somewhere. It gets run through the refinery, you get a bunch of products out, LPG, gasoline, naphtha, diesel, fuel oil, and then those products get individually put in tanks somewhere at the refinery. Then again, they're shipped off by boat somewhere towards the distribution center, again put in tanks, trucked somewhere to, let's say, a gas station, again in tanks, and then we buy it and we stick it in our cars in tanks. So there's a lot of storage at all the different nodes in the system, and what that means is if there's a little bit less oil coming out one month versus the month before, then we just release some of the oil from our tank, and prices will go up a little bit, but we just kind of have plenty of buffer to release, and then in the next month we just produce a little bit more. You compare that to the power markets where there's no real storage facility right now. In the future we will have, there's a lot of talk about, for instance, when we have electric cars, we'll be able to buy power from the grid when it's cheap, off-peak, store it in our car battery, and then sell it back to the grid when it's expensive. So there will be a lot more buffer, but right now power grids are pretty stupid, right? So there's not a whole lot of storage. What happens is if you get demand that's slightly more than supply, then prices just rocket to infinity, and if it's vice versa, then prices just rocket down to zero very quickly. And so it leads to a lot of volatility, it leads to a system that is very susceptible to shock. And in the financial system, the kind of parallel to that would be a country that doesn't have a lot of bank accounts. If you don't have anywhere to store your money, maybe you can use rice to store value for a little while, but rice goes bad, and any other store of value, if it's not secure, has similar problems. So if you have a kind of a minor shock in the system, like you have an unexpected child or your father needs some medical attention, then you get outcomes that are very, very suboptimal. So this, from a social perspective, is something that has a big need, and it's something that a number of social enterprises as well as VC firms are really seeing as an opportunity to bank the unbanked. And I think this is one area where kind of the opportunity lies in the world, the kind of cryptocurrency world in the region here. So there are a number of different ways you can actually solve this, right? We've all heard about M-Pesa and how successful that's been in Africa. There are a couple other companies that are using kind of different technology platforms. One is called Jana. So they're using mobile airtime minutes kind of as their currency. They figured out a way to plug into back-end systems of telcos all around the world. Similar company called Ladoo in India. But certainly, Bitcoin could be one of those solutions, and one that would be very successful potentially, and kind of much more frictionless than a lot of the other systems that have been built. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think one of the main problems with this historically has been that there's been a bit of volatility, and the argument goes that as long as you've held it and it's kind of gone up over time, then that's okay. But for a lot of these folks who kind of live hand to mouth, they can't really afford that fluctuation in the short term. So in order to have real proper distribution of wallets, I think you'll need to settle, at least in the short term, the fiat versus Bitcoin kind of currency exchange rate fluctuation. So there's a new startup called BitReserve that aims to address this that's come out recently. So we'll see. There's a lot of innovation in the space. Second pain point, so people need to transfer money. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, all of us in the Bitcoin community have read a lot about how the potential for this technology to disrupt the payment space is really one of the main drivers for growth moving forward. So, even the thing that's interesting is that in the region, even within certain countries here, this is a really big problem. Transferring money from one part of Cambodia to the other is something that's not really easy to do. But of course, the international remittance market is a market that is very well documented, and it's something that is also a big opportunity. $500 billion, $250 billion of that is in Asia. The top 3 remittance markets in the world are in Asia. China is 60 billion plus, India is about 50, ASEAN as a total is about 50, and the Philippines, which is the 3rd largest nation in the world for remittance acceptances, is about 25 billion. So that represents 9% of overall GDP. It's pretty significant. If we can actually get some efficiencies there, then it would be quite interesting for growth in places like the Philippines. So we don't need to go into some of the details here. I think you guys are all familiar with how complex the existing system is. There are many banks along the way. They all take a fee, a cut of their own. If you don't have a bank account, then you have to wire through services like Western Union, which charge exorbitant fees. One thing that is kind of unique about the region is that you don't have the same kind of infrastructure that you do in other parts of the world. And because of that, you can't just assume that you're going to go to a B2C strategy and get access to users immediately. So you really need to go more in a B2B2C model here. And so, I was at a startup conference last week called Startup Asia, where I was sitting at an Indonesia track, and one of the speakers said, content is king, but in his country, distribution is King Kong, right? And he pointed out the fact that the largest distributor of music in Indonesia is actually Kentucky Fried Chicken. Right? So it's a little bit surprising. So in this part of the world, you really need distribution centers and brick-and-mortar businesses to partner with, especially at the beginning, to drive adoption. And one example of that is a company called Coins.ph. So in the Philippines, they've partnered up with 3,000 locations of remittance shops and pawn shops where you can take your Bitcoin that's been sent over by your family members from overseas and kind of get cash out. Another pain point is that merchants are getting charged a lot for accepting credit cards. I mean, Steve spent quite a bit of time on this, so I won't drill down into this too much more, but it's a pain point that's not unique to the region. It's something that businesses go through all over the place. I think personally that if you're looking at this as an opportunity from an entrepreneur or a VC perspective, it's something interesting in the region, but I think there's lower hanging fruit in other parts of the world. And the reason for that is that in certain other sectors, like in cloud computing and SaaS, software as a service, for instance, you can actually take a product and copy and paste it for any country that you're selling it into, because all your infrastructure sits in the cloud, and whether you're buying it from Estonia or whether you're buying the product from the US, it's the same kind of methodologies, the same kind of search engine optimization, and the same kind of funnels that they use, and the same back end. But for these merchants, you need some sort of integration in the back end, which is specific to location dependent banking relationships, for instance, right? So to be able to copy and paste some of these solutions across countries it's not as fluid as doing it, let's say, across the United States, or eventually, China when it opens up again. So I think it's an opportunity, but maybe something that's a little bit less compelling. Now, I haven't exactly put my finger on what exactly, but I feel like there's definitely got to be an opportunity in Singapore. The fact that Singapore is quickly becoming the private banking hub of the world, I mean, particularly after the UBS case in Switzerland, where they opened up all their details to the US regulators, the Swiss have started to move their money over here very quickly. It's always been the private banking center of Asia. There's a lot of wealth being created in places like China and Indonesia. And so the fact that we are a financial hub, there are a bunch of hedge funds here, there are a lot of really established political and financial types here who could serve as chairman of let's say an OTC exchange or a dark pool might be kind of interesting. So I don't exactly know what the answer to that is. We've kind of brainstormed a little bit about that. last year. But I think there's got to be an opportunity around that and kind of leveraging the fact that Singapore is a financial hub. I think the last kind of thing that I'll talk about is, every country wants more social cohesion, and every country is experiencing wider and wider income gaps. And that goes for developed as well as developing countries. Even in places like Bhutan, picture here, which is not a very developed country, they're experiencing this as well. The rural countryside, monks who live there here, you can see in very humble conditions, live in much more humble conditions than those who live in people who live in the city. So, a funny thing happened to me on my trip to Bhutan towards the end of last year. We were flying in on a flight very similar to this on Druk Air. My wife was to my left and the gentleman was to my right, and we started talking. And he was asking very normal questions: how long are you here for, where are you from? He was local Bhutanese, and he invited us over for dinner. So a few days later, we went to his house, had a very nice dinner. We popped in and we kind of found out that he runs the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bhutan. And his house guests that he had over for dinner were pretty interesting. The guy who ran the Ministry of Monastic Affairs, the son of the first man who climbed Mount Everest, Tenzing Norgay, and the crown princess of Bhutan. So we had a fantastic conversation. They shared a lot about the realities of kind of social realities around Bhutan, and also shared a lot about their economy, which is really interesting. So 60% of their GDP comes from hydropower, and the fact that they have a lot of rivers is really an asset for them. They don't have a lot of money to develop those assets, but the Indians are very friendly. So they come, they develop all those, they pay for it, and then they get paid back in very cheap electricity. And so local prices are also very cheap. In fact, if you go on Wikipedia, I think it says the second cheapest electricity prices in the world after Venezuela, which has constant power outages, as we know. So, oh, and by the way, the villagers also get free electricity for the first however many kilowatt hours that they spend. So, we left, we had a great dinner, left, and the gentleman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and I stayed in touch. He pinged me a couple months afterwards, and he said, one of the things we talked about was also nonprofit work that we're kind of involved in. He said, I know you and your wife are very involved in the NGO circuit, and the Queen Mother here has an NGO called the Tarayana Foundation, which is very focused on helping villagers in the kind of outer suburbs or outer countryside. So if if you had any ideas on how you could help her foundation get a little bit more integrated into the international NGO community, she said she'd love to meet you, and next time you come back to town, please let us know. So I said, okay. I was kind of knocking my head and thinking about how we could help them and what they had as a resource. And cheap electricity, basically free electricity for some of these villagers, is kind of interesting. So I wrote back and I said, there's this thing called Bitcoin. Have you ever heard of it? And he said, no, I've never heard of it. I said, okay, well, there's this part of the ecosystem called mining, and the two main inputs are kind of hardware and cheap electricity. And so I know that's one thing that you guys have. Is this something that we might be able to explore together? Let's say we could make it a social enterprise. I'm not sure if it'll make a lot of money or not, but we can find an NGO, I'm sure, to finance the mining equipment. We can give it to the villagers out in the countryside, do a little bit of training for them on this is what a mouse is, this is what the internet is, and that's good for the country in and of itself. And then from there, they can mine with their free electricity and then give back a small portion of their proceeds to the Tarayana Foundation, to the NGO that kind of finances the hardware, and then get to keep a bunch of the money for themselves. So it's an interesting opportunity. Again, I don't know if it's a purely commercial one, but it's something that we're kind of incubating at Amasia on the side. So that is it. I mean, there are a bunch of other things I haven't even touched on, kind of proper exchanges and so forth, of which many are cropping up in the region. And I think a lot of the 2.0 applications that we heard about this morning are fascinating and will have relevance to the region, but they're kind of more global in nature. But those are just a few of the things that kind of popped at top of mind. So that's it. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, feel free.
Any questions?
Okay.
What do you see as the biggest obstacle to mass Bitcoin adoption in the Asia region?
So Asia is a very big region, right? Actually, I heard a saying the other day, which I thought was quite amusing. Whatever you've heard about China is true somewhere in China, right? People think about China as one very unified country. Again, I mentioned I do a lot of work in North Korea, and people have this idea that North Korea is one country. Actually, it's very, very diverse, even within North Korea as well. So when you talk about Asia, I mean, it's the biggest region in the whole freaking world, right? So It's very diverse. The kind of problems and obstacles to adoption are very different in different kind of jurisdictions, even within certain countries. But I think in terms of the emerging market countries, it's really about that B2B2C and the partnership aspect of things, because people don't have, they're increasingly having smartphones, but even that's not really 100% there. And so they don't watch TV necessarily, they don't have the radio and all these things. So the traditional channels to get to folks, to get them to adopt anything, that can be buying soap, or that can be washing your hands, and that can be obviously using a Bitcoin wallet. So all those traditional channels are much more difficult than what we're used to in the developed world. Places like China, obviously the regulations, probably the kind of the parties' view on Bitcoin is probably the biggest obstacle there. So I think it really depends country by country, but those are some of the examples, I think.
Yeah, I'd love to focus on Indonesia, for example. Do you have any idea what sort of the Bitcoin awareness is in these sort of emerging Southeast Asian markets that have the banking sort of metrics, call it the ones that were under 25% of the population being banked? What the awareness level is there, and what would be the right channels to make them, to cause them to become more aware?
Sure. So Indonesia, I can speak to a little bit because we have two helpers at home and they're both Indonesian. And actually my mother-in-law is Indonesian, Chinese, and so my wife speaks Bahasa, and so we have a pretty strong affiliation, I guess you could say, with Indonesia. I was really surprised, actually, that when I opened up my WeChat application on my phone, I saw one of my helpers on it, and it said, do you want to add Yuli to your WeChat app? So they're actually, pretty tech savvy, and obviously she lives in Singapore, so she's exposed to a little bit more than some of the folks from her village. But I would say that there's definitely a lot more kind of leapfrogging in a lot of these jurisdictions, going directly to things like WeChat as they get to smartphones. But in terms of Bitcoin itself, have they heard of it? I would say certainly in the villages not. There is an exchange in Indonesia called Artabit, which is doing pretty good work. And so I think the more savvy folks, the people who are living in the cities, the people who might have access to foreign social media. By the way, Indonesia is probably the most social nation on earth. I mean, it has, I think it's like the third largest, Facebook engagement in the world, and they have other social networks. Twitter engagement is super high. They have their own kind of specialized social networks as well. So I think a country like Indonesia specifically would be a little bit more doable because there is this integration between all the folks there. If you could figure out ways to get memes to go viral, then there will be ways to penetrate. But I think it's still very low, particularly as you get outside the cities.
All right. Well, I guess that concludes the day. Thank you.
Thanks very much.